Hi guys, so this is Kyle. I wanted to make a different kind of video. I think this is going to be a recurring bit. I'm going to call tentatively No Notes, just because I wanted to kind of just talk open-ended and freely about my thoughts about some things going on. And today I wanted to talk about what happened this past weekend. On Saturday, we had the dueling events of sorts between the nationwide No Kings protests and, of course, Trump's military parade in D.C. Now, setting aside on whether you think the military parade was good or not, there's been a lot of discussion from both the left and the right about the purpose of a protest like No Kings, where you have a whole bunch of large fundraising organizations raising money from, in some cases, wealthy individuals. Infamously, an heiress to the Walton family of Walmart fame took out a full-page banner ad in the New York Times in favor of the No Kings protesters, and a lot of people have pointed to that as these are progressives who want to, tax the rich or eat the rich or however they're going to characterize us, and yet here they are participating in a movement that is supported by a multi-billionaire, right? And then from the left, you have the criticism that, asking police for permission is not going to create the kind of change that we want to see. And I really do hear that point, I do. But as somebody who studied political science in college, there's something to be said for the fact that no protest movement in history anywhere has ever been linear. Not even revolutions in context were as linear or unimodal as people would like to think. Like, the American Revolution was not just the revolutionaries in the fields fighting against the British redcoats. You did have journalists putting out pro-America propaganda, or what would have passed for propaganda at the time. You had people in the streets participating in what you would consider kind of a civil debate of sorts in some cases, or uncivil debate in others. I mean, infamously, you had pro-British collaborators during the Revolutionary War who were getting dragged out of their homes by non-soldiers, otherwise people completely unengaged from the actual war going on. They would get dragged out of their homes and tarred and feathered in the streets and tried to, embarrass out of their homes. And so I think that the impression that there's only one correct way to do even in the context of anti-authoritarian resistance, is just totally wrong and incorrect. There are places for things like a quote-unquote lib-pilled protest like No Kings, because there are people grandparents and nursing home residents who are going to come out in their wheelchairs to a thing like No Kings who otherwise would never participate. And they should be seen on the streets just as much as all of the able-bodied people who can take to the streets as well. And it does also give an outlet for people in marginalized communities who would almost certainly be, punished by the law in some way if they took part in some kind of non-coordinated, non-permitted action. But ultimately, safety and security is a privilege that is only enjoyed by some people, and we should want as many people to participate as possibly can, and that also means accommodating the people who would almost certainly get wrapped up in legal trouble or potentially medical trouble, participating in something that is unorganized and more likely to cause some kind of confrontation with police, even if that confrontation does not involve arrests, but it often does. The benefit of something permitted and organized like this is that anybody and everybody can participate. It becomes legitimized in the eyes of people who don't participate in, quote-unquote revolutionary kind of ideas and spheres and echo spaces. For a lot of people, these are the only ways that they can protest, or at least the only way that they feel safe protesting, which is totally valid. Another point that I want to talk about is that, a lot of people have brought up that no fascist regime has ever been overthrown by peaceful protest. And I think it's important to point out the parallels between what is going on today in America and what has happened in fascist regimes in the past. But as a student of history, as somebody who's spent way too much of their own personal time, looking at Nazi Germany, how it happened, Nazi ideology, Nazi governance, Nazi economy, who's looked into, Benito Mussolini and where the fascist movement came from, how it lines up to things like communist Russia, there's not anything right now in America that makes me say that this is, cut and dry a fascist regime. Now, I do think our current governing structure and the people in power share more in common with an authoritarian regime than a democracy, right? I think that's a fair characterization. There's a lot of things we're seeing happening in this country right now that the only analogs we really have are things going on in, Viktor Orban's Hungary. That is, by most standards of the West, an authoritarian state. They have elections, they have an air of legitimacy, but it's a top-down control structure where one person has most of the power in their system. Now, I think we're approaching a similar point in America, but we saw just this past week some ways in which that's not true. Because anybody who's watched any military function whatsoever knows that our military knows how to march in lockstep, organized in straight lines when they want to. The decision to kind of meander about through this military parade, I think, is a purposeful one. And you can talk about whether or not this was some kind of protest, quote unquote, by the army and the members of the army and the higher-ups at the army. But either way, it's an objective fact that they can march more organized and more in lockstep than they did. And whether that was a purposeful decision or not, it does show that there is some resistance to authoritarian tendencies in this government. But, Trump unilaterally federalizing the National Guard in California without consulting the governor, without consulting the mayor, without consulting the LAPD, all of that stuff rings authoritarian. And all of those people have said several times that that intervention was not needed and was not wanted. And this is not praise of institutions like the mayoralty of LA, the LAPD, or even Governor Newsom in California, as they have proven in some ways over-willing to engage with the National Guard, which means that, I don't think they would have hesitated to call in the National Guard if they actually needed it. But they didn't, but it was sent anyways. And that does ring authoritarian in some way, shape, or form. But, and this is a big but, we do still have voting. We do currently still have democracy. Now, 2026 will be a bit of a litmus test. Will there be organized efforts to have fewer voters, lower turnout, suppression of certain communities on election day? That has yet to be seen. There are some organized efforts to disenfranchise certain groups of voters now, but we have time to prepare for that disenfranchisement. If you've, for example, been kicked off the voter rolls because you haven't voted in 4 or 6 or 8 years, or however many elections, depending on what your state election laws are, you can go and you can register again. If your state has gotten rid of same-day voter registration or absentee voting, you can plan around those kinds of things. Most states have some accommodation for disabilities, and they have some accommodation for work. They have early voting or mail-in voting. So you can do research in your states and see what ways you can still participate. Our democracy is not yet dead, and I think we are still more a democracy than people are giving it credit for, especially on my left flank, which is saying something because I consider myself to be comfortably progressive. I'm pretty far left as far as things go, but I am not willing to call this a fascist regime yet. There's still a lot of boxes that have to be checked that are not checked for me to feel comfortable doing that kind of, I don't want to call it fear-mongering, because that's not fear-mongering if it's true, right? But to raise awareness and alertness to that level, because that would signal a need for change in how we think about and resist this regime. That is true. I will lend some credibility to the argument from people to my left. The, people in the online community call them revcoms, revolutionary communists. Now, these people are obviously not on the streets staging revolutions. They're more staging an online revolution against people who ostensibly support the same policies and stuff that they do. They just like arguing online, which is why I don't give these people much credo. But that is one area where they are correct, is that when you have a truly fascist regime, like Hitler's Germany, like Mussolini's Italy, like Franco's Spain, the only way out is forceful regime change. But that's not where we're at now. Right now, we are still at a point where there are democratic processes in place, visibility matters, optics matter, messaging matters, and elections matter. And getting as many people out in the street as possible is very important. More important than the method of protest or means of protest itself. Part of my last year in political science was spent researching the anatomy of dissent and political protest, right? And consistently, scholars have come to the conclusion that when democracy exists in some or any form, or you are working with fragile coalitions, which I think it is fair to call the Trump coalition as it sits now. It is very fragile. If you're watching what's happening in Congress, what's happening in the Senate, even how these different states are reacting, the coalition he has built for himself is very fragile. So when you're looking at fragile regimes like this, it's all about breaking through the glass, breaking the messaging wall that a lot of the supporters of that regime have found themselves in. And getting millions and millions and millions of people onto the streets consistently and reliably and peacefully matters for optics. Now, there's an argument to be had that provoking violent responses might have some value in protests, or creating a socially violent response might have value. That's the kind of thing that we saw in, Rosa Parks' protest, sitting in the segregated buses, or the sit-ins that we saw Martin Luther King participate in, or the Montgomery bus boycotts, right? When they marched across the bridge in Selma, they knew they were going to be met with adversity by the police. But they did it anyways because provoking that adverse response was part of the point, right? And there is value in that. But all of those were part of a broader strategy that did involve ways of protesting where you could get as many people involved as possible, consistently and as widely as you possibly could. While the march in Selma was in part organized to provoke a police response, the Million-Man March in Washington, D.C. was not. It was the opposite. It was a la No Kings, a one-off visibility exercise, where the point was to get as many people to turn out as possible from as many groups as you could possibly get to come there. And there is real value to that. There's real value to things like the Million-Man March that I don't think are being represented properly in the current discourse. There will potentially be a time where this regime is so oppressive and so authoritarian that the only consideration possible might be violent resistance. But that is not where we're at now. We are still at a place where we can have nursing home grandmas roll their wheelchairs out to the streets and hold a sign and protest with the rest of us. And that is not something that we can expect them to partake in once we have gone too far down the rabbit hole. And provoking violence and violent responses just is only so productive in the broader context of things. You know, all of that research shows that in these fragile regimes that are still democratic, where there is still a potential for change without full-scale revolution, which didn't have to happen in things like the women's suffrage movement or in the civil rights era in the 1950s and 60s. We didn't need violent revolution. There was violence, but that wasn't the whole movement, and it was important, vitally, that that wasn't the whole movement. When you have these fragile regimes, getting people into public spaces that everybody is going to report on, it's going to break through ecospheres, and people are going to see that their position isn't the only possible one. And that's really what's important here, because, you know, things like No Kings are going to pop up as they did on Fox News and local TV affiliates, local newspapers where those still exist, or at least local news websites. And, you know, those echo chambers are important to break through in, because the worker who just catches some Fox News or some conservative talk radio on their way to work is going to still be reachable. I know it can feel at times like they will not be, but they are. They are reachable. I know because I talk to a lot of them. I don't know if you can tell or not, but I'm in a truck right now. I'm a truck driver. And I talk to a lot of truck drivers, a profession that is not exactly known for being super liberal. And I have made considerable progress on a lot of people just asking them questions. Hey, have you even heard about this? Did you see what the LA police chief said about the National Guard presence? What do you think about the National Guard presence? You know, talking about collective punishment in the context of like what they're doing with ICE raids, you know, doing these huge dragnet operations at workplaces, wrapping up everybody whether or not they are criminals or even here undocumented. One of the things I've been asking coworkers, and this is a not fictional scenario, in the context of our company it is, but not in the trucking industry, we're a fleet of 120 trucks. What if one of us was working with gangs to smuggle drugs in our trucks, right? And the DEA or ATF or whoever caught that truck driver, right? And then they came into our workplace, they impounded half of our trucks and arrested 3/4 or all of our drivers and held them in jail for the length of time it took them to figure out whether or not we were complicit in those drug raids. You would rightfully be pretty upset about that. And most people I've posed this scenario to agree that that would be upsetting. They would be upset with law enforcement, they would be upset with our government, they'd be upset with the other people, rightfully so, who would put them in this situation in the first place. And so we can reach people with messages like that. When we show that we are just peaceful people who care about our country and where we feel like it is going, it does actually break through and matter to people. I know it doesn't feel like it because we're all in our Twitter and Instagram and Threads and Blue Sky and Reddit and Facebook ecospheres. We only see the stuff that we vehemently agree or vehemently disagree with. So it's easy to feel like this is having no impact on anybody. But as somebody who goes out of their way to find feedback like it, I have seen a lot of, wow, I just drove past the No Kings protest in my town today and I had no idea that this many of my neighbors felt this way. I had no idea that this many people were being affected by this. You know, I really have to consider some of my stances. And is that common? No. But people aren't necessarily going to comment publicly all the time when they're questioning their views. Even myself, when I'm in testy conversations with people, I fight my point to failure. And it might irritate some people, whatever, because it doesn't seem like my mind has changed in that argument. But by the time we end that argument or that debate, that discussion, however you want to characterize it, I will sit there and I will, finish my drive for the day or whatever, and I'll be sitting there thinking about the discussion I just had. Maybe they made some good points. Maybe this does change something about how I think about the world. And that's how a lot of people work. You're not going to ever participate in an online exchange where you have a back and forth, and at the end somebody goes, wow, you really changed the way that I thought about this. That's not how human psychology works, really. Humans hate being wrong, and especially admitting that they're wrong. They would much rather disengage from that conversation, change the way they think, and then next time they have one of those conversations, argue a different standpoint without ever acknowledging that they were incorrect. And that might not be satisfying to some people, but it does matter in a democracy where people take those changed views to the ballot box and vote with them. So while we still have a democracy, while we still have an opportunity to fight, while we still have an opportunity to get everybody involved in a way that we cannot when armed resistance becomes necessary. And I hope it never will become necessary, and I don't think it will ever be necessary. I am more optimistic than most about the future for this country. But while we can still get those people to the streets, we absolutely should. And if it means getting a permit from the police, I'm sorry if it upsets the revolutionaries, but file the permit. Get those people out on the streets. Because few things have quite as much impact as nursing homes emptying out onto the streets in protest against what people view as an overly oppressive and anti-democratic regime. And that matters for something. So, that's my no notes 2 cents for the day. I hope you enjoyed. If you like it, please drop a like, maybe drop a comment. I will sift through the comments and engage what I feel is productive discussion, but I will also filter out anything that I think is hateful, discriminatory, bigoted, anything like that. So please keep the discussion in the comments civil, but do talk in the comments, because I think it's important to have discourses like these and, put a finger on the pulse of how the country is feeling. So drop a comment, subscribe if you want to see more of these. I don't have an idea yet of how often I'm going to do videos like this, but I do enjoy this kind of format. I talk a lot better talking off the cuff rather than trying to write scripts and stuff like that. It's not really my thing. I'm a US extemp kid at heart. So, yeah, until next time.